February 21st marked the 35th anniversary of the Legend of Zelda franchise. To celebrate, I decided to play the first game from 1986, simply called The Legend of Zelda. This game took me by surprise. I wasn't really planning to create this video or to review the game, but after playing and completing it, I decided to share my thoughts. Despite being the first game in the series, I don't believe many people nowadays have actually played it, but this was the most interesting gaming experience I've ever had. We know the Zelda series as this legacy franchise that's super old, with fans of many ages, but seeing it through the very first game, where there is no hype, nobody knows who Link, Zelda, or Ganon are, nobody knows what the Triforce is, there's no Master Sword, no Hylian Shield, none of that. It was very interesting. It's so cute and humble at the same time. It's like, hi guys, here's this brand new game I made. It's called The Legend of Zelda. I hope you guys played and enjoyed. It's very interesting to see how the series has changed after 35 years. And I just realized as I'm writing this is the oldest game I've ever completed at this point. During my time playing the game, I took down some notes to record my thoughts and impressions. After reading them, I noticed that most of the comments during the playthrough were me complaining about how unfair and difficult the game is, and I'll get to that in a bit. But most of my comments after completing it were mostly of praise. Here's a quick rundown of my thoughts while playing the game. These were my notes during the first 2 hours of the game. This is just a Link to the Past, but worse in every way. I'll explain later in the video. This game makes you feel like you did a lot in a short amount of time. I played less than 2 hours, but it felt like 4 hours. This game gives you no direction at all. It's like, if you say the game is hard, it tells you,
well, too bad, life is hard.
It's too much like real life because of how random it is. This can be good or bad depending on who's playing. Now my notes from the rest of the playthrough. What's funny about the Zelda series is that the developers don't even have to put that much into the story because the fandom will make it up for them. There is no story. Because there's no towns and cities, it really feels like you're all alone in the wilderness. It really feels like you versus the world. The only people you meet are some people hiding in caves. Like, what's up with that? Because the game doesn't help you with in-game tutorials, it makes you feel very alone. In most games, there are tutorials that pop up to show you how the game works. But here, the game is like,
Nah, that you're on your own.
And it forces you to figure everything out by yourself. Excluding the manual, of course. It's like the game is dead. It's just you and the NPCs and the enemies. That's it. This game is so unfair. Now here are my thoughts after the playthrough. After completing the game without a guide, other than the manual, but that doesn't count, it was extremely satisfying. Yes, I did Google one thing, the location of the silver arrows, but other than that, I was on my own. I think playing this game without the manual is a very, very big mistake, as it's actually part of the game. It's not some extra optional booklet the developers put in. It's actually important for playing the game. It even says at the beginning of the game to look at the manual. It includes the map, which is non-existent inside of the actual game. It has more context on the story, and it gives tips on what to actually do. Playing this game with nothing but the manual makes it feel like a real adventure, not like in the other Zelda games where it feels like you're watching a movie with interactive sections that you take part in. Yes, the manual does blatantly show you where the first 4 dungeons are, but that is part of the story, because Impa directly tells Link where those dungeons are. In Zelda 1, it doesn't feel like there's a script. Well, actually, there really is none. There's practically no story in this game. Nothing is set in stone, and it's all up to you. Whereas in the other Zelda game, you have a script that's set in stone, and it doesn't really feel like you have any power to control the outcome of the story as much. Of course, that's compared to the first Zelda game. The other games still feel like an adventure, but this game takes it to another level. This is the only video game I have ever played where I took down notes, like a journal. Not because I wanted to, but because I actually had to. This game is not linear and has no quest log, so you will get lost if you do not take down notes. This is not a problem with the other major Zelda titles, as they are designed so that it's basically impossible to get very lost. Even in Breath of the Wild, there is a map in the Sheikah Slate, so you can't really get lost. There is no in-game map in this game, so you have to use a map outside of the game, or you will have a very hard time and you will get lost extremely easily. And if you get lost here, you are screwed. In the final dungeon, I decided to just memorize it mentally, and that gave me a huge headache. That was a big mistake. Because in real life, your to-do lists don't automatically change magically when something happens. You have to manually write or type the changes yourself. The aspect of going out of the game and writing notes down on a map added to the experience. It felt more genuine and real. This game is so incredibly difficult. The speed I input actions is at the level of competitive gaming. It kind of feels like playing Melee. I cannot fathom how people could finish this game without the quick saves. You guys are OG gangsters. But as frustrating as it is, I think it should be looked at the same way as the Souls games, where the frustration and the unfairness is part of the experience. It's sort of part of the charm of the game. The only difference is that games like Dark Souls are intentionally difficult and unfair, while here it was not. The randomness and the lack of direction in this game really surprised me. I got the red ring completely by accident, which is cool. Things would probably have gotten real bad if I didn't get the red ring. A lot of times in the game, like fighting the fucking blue fucking stupid whiz robes, felt like a damn shootout with guns. Dodging bullets and hiding behind cover. That's not what's supposed to happen in a medieval fantasy game, but okay. Also, those blue whiz robes, man. Those blue whiz robes. They can use after image and it feels like I'm fighting a Dragon Ball character. Like, come on, man. I don't know why, but as much as the game is frustrating and unfair, for some reason, it feels bittersweet after completing it. I did not get this feeling with the other Zelda games. Here it's like, yay, we beat Ganon. But it's also like that feeling when you were a kid, when you were playing with friends, but then you had to leave because you didn't really want to go. Or maybe it's because of how catchy the ending music is. This is a very cute game, even in the official artwork. It was never meant to be serious or dark. It just so happens that, compared to the modern games, this game is so extremely difficult. It is a very short game by today's standards, but it makes up for it for being hard as balls. A lot of my comments and notes after playing the game were comparisons to A Link to the Past type games, or what I would like to call the Zelda 3 formula games. So these games are Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword. The Zelda 1 formula games are, well, Zelda 1 and Breath of the Wild. The best way I can describe it is that the Zelda 3 formula feels more magical, spectacular, and cinematic, while the Zelda 1 formula feels more raw and real. It's different vibes. You can't say one is objectively better than the other. In a sense, Nintendo created two different game series under one name. Sort of. The biggest surprise to me was realizing how different this game was to A Link to the Past and how similar it is to Breath of the Wild. The very first comment I wrote down during my playthrough was, "This is just A Link to the Past, but worse in every single way." Now, I know that sounds harsh, but even after finishing the game and praising it, I still think it's true. In terms of how the games feel, or their vibe, A Link to the Past is way more dramatic because it actually has a story. All Zelda 1 has is a backstory. This game doesn't take itself that seriously, it just wants to be fun. Except, the game is hard as balls. The ending of this game is very cutesy and humble, whereas A Link to the Past is all triumphant and dramatic and power of the gods and blah 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 blah. In terms of difficulty, A Link to the Past was difficult, but it wasn't this frustrating. Zelda 1 is not only difficult, but it's also unfair and frustrating. In terms of music, there's 3 or 4 songs in Zelda 1? A Link to the Past soundtrack, in my opinion, is one of the best in any art form, not just video games. but the ending music in Zelda 1 is one of the best I've heard. Obviously, a lot of these comparisons to A Link to the Past are not fair because Zelda 1 was not as technologically advanced, but there are still some things that should be pointed out. The Zelda games have progressively become more cinematic because of their popularity. In A Link to the Past, the ending is like,
Congratulations, mortal. You have defeated Ganon, King of Thieves, Prince of Darkness, with the power of the gods. I shall grant you one wish.
but in Zelda 1 it's like, yay, we won! Woohoo! This game made me appreciate Breath of the Wild's concept more, as now I understand what the developers were trying to do by soft rebooting the franchise. I was not expecting these games to be this similar. Breath of the Wild is the most faithful game to the first game in the series. They have an extremely similar essence or soul. The only major differences I can find would be the dungeons. Breath of the Wild's shrines and the divine beasts are very different from all the other games in the series, and most of them are optional, while the levels, or the labyrinths, in Zelda 1 are all mandatory. Then again, the shrines, like the labyrinths, are underground. Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle, however, is very similar to the Zelda 1 labyrinths. It's a large, labyrinth with simple puzzles, a crap ton of enemies, and a lot of secret rooms. Having most of the map open from the very beginning makes you feel free to do whatever you want, and it's a big design choice that greatly affects how the games feel. Of course, in Zelda 1, the entire map is not open from the get-go, but compared to the other games, it's pretty open. Now, the biggest difference is that you can use A Link to the Past formula over and over, hence the other 3D Zelda games. But you can't reuse Zelda 1's empty feeling formula. That's why it took 30 years to get Breath of the Wild. For Zelda 1 and Breath of the Wild, the games are about finding dungeons and exploring the overworld. In the Zelda 3 formula games, the overworld is simply a means to get to the dungeons, and it's less about the exploration, more about completing the said dungeons. You could maybe count Wind Waker as an exception, but that's a big maybe. They're very different vibes, though one is not objectively better than the other. This game, like Breath of the Wild, shows why video games are special as an art form. You can't dictate what happens in a book or a movie, but you can in video games. So in video games with a minimal story, it feels like everything you do and every decision you make impacts the world more. Liam Triforce put it perfectly. It's beautifully flawed. The best way I can describe it is like this. The Zelda 3 formula games are great games, but Zelda 1 and Breath of the Wild are great experiences. You remember the Zelda 3 games more for what they did, but you remember Zelda 1 and Breath of the Wild more for how they made you feel. When I see this game, then I see how the Zelda franchise is now. It's very different. I think mainly because modern Zelda has a legacy to live up to, while this game didn't. This game is so simple, in a good way. People treat the games differently nowadays, and so do the developers. But what hasn't changed the past 35 years is that the developers still focus on creating high-quality masterpieces for each generation. Thanks for watching.